I'm Brandon, and this is Video Game History, a show where I look back on certain franchises of video games and retrospectively review them. To kick things off, I'll be taking a look at Cartoon Network's extensive catalogue of video games that spans the past 16 years. Today we go back to November 14, 2000, to the very first game released based on a Cartoon Network show, Dexter's Laboratory Robot Rampage, for the Game Boy Color. Well, actually, according to Wikipedia, both this and the Powerpuff Girls Bad Mojo Jojo released on the same day in North America, which must have been a hallmark day for Cartoon Network fans, but I've decided to review this one first. So let's have a look at the background surrounding this release. Robot Rampage was developed by Altron and published by BAM Entertainment on November 14, 2000, as I mentioned. However, calling it the first Cartoon Network game is a little bit dubious. You see, Dexter's Laboratory Robot Rampage is actually a reskin of Altron's game Elevator Action EX, which was released on the Game Boy Color less than 2 months earlier. From what I can gather, Elevator Action EX was only released in Europe and Japan. They then decided to give it a Dexter's Laboratory skin to sell it in North America. Unfortunately, there is very little information about this scenario that exists on the internet, so I'm going to assume what I've pieced together is true. Now, when I say reskin, I mean reskin. This game is literally identical to Elevator Action EX, right down to having 3 playable characters while unlocking a boss character to play as upon completion of the game. And judging by the 2 surviving reviews of the game, or perhaps the only 2 reviews this game ever got, it actually seems like this game might be quite good. IGN gave it a 7 out of 10, while similarly, GameSpot gave it a 6.9 out of 10. But rather than take their word for it, I'm going to dive in myself. As I alluded to earlier, you have 3 characters to choose from: regular Dexter, Dexter in RoboSuit 1, or Dexter in RoboSuit 2. RoboSuit 1 starts you off with 5 hearts of health, but makes you move more slowly, while RoboSuit 2 starts you with only 3 hearts of health, but allows you to jump further and move quicker. As you may have guessed, regular Dexter is the all-rounder character and has 4 hearts of health upon starting the game. While the different suits is kinda neat, I can't help but thinking adding proper different characters instead of robot suits would have been much cooler. Would it have really been so hard to add in Dee or Monkey? I also find it funny that Dee appears on the cover, despite never making an appearance in the game, only being referenced once by Mandark in the beginning. In fact, the whole cover is misleading. Dexter never gets to control a cool mech. This cover tells you nothing about what this game is, other than it's based on Dexter's Laboratory. Moving on to the actual game, the story starts off with Mandark taking over Dexter's robots and setting them loose in his lab, and now it's up to Dexter to take it back. All of this story information is accompanied by a horrific text scrolling sound that sounds like a machine gun firing off. After playing the game for less than 30 seconds, it's very clear that this is an elevator action game. You travel up and down elevators, shooting enemies, and collecting the allotted amount of secret codes for each level. Getting stuck on needing to find the last code could have been a nightmare in this game, as some of the levels are rather large. However, there exists a nice mechanic that activates upon you reaching the end of the level. If you don't have all of the codes, it will transport you back to the location you need to go to, which saves a lot of annoying backtracking. The game's controls are simple, using the A button to jump, while B button shoots. Your jump will come in very handy during the game, as you can leap over bullets and jump across gaps without having to wait for an elevator. Some enemies can even be killed by jumping on their head Mario style, which is something I didn't discover until later in the game, but it definitely came in handy once I did figure it out. Down button allows you to duck, which assists in dodging enemy fire, while the up and down buttons control the elevators once you're inside of them. Going in red doors can change a weapon into a more powerful ray gun or grenades, or you can increase your health or score, which can be used to give yourself extra lives. There's a bit of risk involved here, however, as you often have to make the decision between whether you want to ensure you keep the weapon you have or refill your health. One huge downside of this is that if you get the grenades, you are screwed. They are by far the worst weapons in the game, and you're good as dead if you end up with them. I was also incredibly confused how to use the red doors at first. It seemed like I was just randomly getting pulled into them and that none of the buttons would let me enter. This problem stems from the game just dropping you in and giving you literally no instructions on how the mechanics work. Luckily for me, I've played Elevator Action before, but for someone new they'd be even more lost than I was. I also had no idea what my objective was. Eventually I figured it out, and I felt like an idiot. By standing on the white lines next to the red doors, you're able to enter them, and upon entering one of these doors containing a secret code, I figured out that I would need to be collecting all of them to advance. So that explains why there is a counter at the top of the screen. By foregoing a button prompt to enter the doors, the game creates a problem where you're sometimes forced to go into doors that you really don't want to. Too many times I ended up with the grenades or found myself surrounded by enemies because I was made to enter a door when I didn't want to. The game consists of 4 stages, each containing 4 scenes, which is just a fancy way of saying 4 levels. The final scene of every level requires you to defeat a bunch of enemies in a small hallway. These endings to stages are extremely anticlimactic, particularly because the combat is not where this game shines. Enemies also vary from level to level, with robot dogs and small Roomba looking robots that take multiple hits to kill being added alongside the regular robots as you progress. One thing I enjoyed a lot about the enemies is that they travelled around the level quite intelligently. Rather than just staying on the floor that they're spawned on, they'll take escalators and elevators just like you do. You could also consider elevators and elevator shafts to be a sort of enemy. As you move about levels, you need to be constantly aware of being crushed by rising or falling elevators, and if you fall more than one level down an elevator shaft, you're met with an instant death. Fortunately, death isn't a huge setback as there is a great checkpoint system in place. Usually in a game like this, death would make you start from scratch, however that is not the case here. Unfortunately, a lot of my deaths came in a very specific, cheap way. Most of the times I'd take damage were when I'd be coming out of a door, which feels incredibly cheap. This becomes far more frustrating in later levels, where the game throws a greater number of enemies at you. At times I would enter a door and have 3 robots shooting at me as I came out, with a robot dog running across the ground for good measure, making it next to impossible to not take at least one hit. Every now and then an occasional wrinkle is thrown into the gameplay, like weak floors you can fall through and sensor alarms you can trip. The breakable floors force you to utilise Dexter's jump ability and makes you focus on your surroundings. I think they missed a big opportunity here though. The robots don't fall through these floors when stepped on, which would have added an extra layer of strategy if you were able to lure the robots into these traps. For the most part the game is pretty easy. That is until you reach the last stage. The robot dogs will fuck you up, and you basically need to utilise every single one of your lives to beat each scene in the final stage. Seriously, half the time you cannot do anything to avoid taking hits due to the increased amount of enemies and the door problem I mentioned earlier. The very final scene of the game has you finally encountering Mandark. Well, sort of. You actually face off against Mandark's super robot, which is far better when compared to the ending of the previous 3 stages. Though, once you know what you're doing in the boss battle, it becomes super easy to win. Upon defeating the super robot, you get to kick Mandark out of your lab, and you unlock the super robot to use in the game. Super Robot is a combination of the 2 robo suits. It gives you the 5 hearts of health you get with the first robo suit, but you still maintain all of the speed and agility of the second robo suit, making the Super Robot by far the best character.
Coming up next, it's Dexter's Laboratory on Cartoon Network.
So what's my verdict on Dexter's Laboratory Robot Rampage? It's okay. It's fun for the most part, but there are some definite flaws that are incredibly obvious and bring down your enjoyment significantly. I just can't help but think about the potential this game could have had if it wasn't just a reskin. If Ultron were going to delay the release of Elevator Action EX in North America for 2 months, surely they could have worked on altering a few things that would have made Robot Rampage so much better. The game is only about 2.5 hours long, so if the only adjustment was making the game longer instead of the exact same length, the game would have benefited greatly. Instead, it's just the same as Elevator Action EX and can barely be considered a Dexter's Lab game. I think the idea of inserting something like Dexter's Lab into an already pre-existing game is really cool, but not changing anything other than the skin of the game is extremely lazy and actually kind of upsetting considering this was Dexter and Cartoon Network's video game debut. In this day and age, something like this would have been a nifty little $5 to $10 DLC pack for Elevator Action EX, rather than a full-blown release as its own game. Overall, I would still recommend you play it though, as it's nowhere near awful and it won't take up too much of your time. There's definitely something here for both Dexter's Lab and video game fans alike to enjoy.